Back with another episode of The Blue Turf. This is Thad Bell. Across the table from me, I have Eric Bergerud. How are you today, sir?
Anytime you invite me to come out to the world-famous Kansas City Soccer Dome, Thad, it's going to be a good Kansas City day.
You know, we sometimes just have to flip all of our schedules around just so that we can both be here at the same time.
It was amazing that we got it to work this time, but...
Eric's over here canceling meetings.
No, I got a meeting canceled, and it was like, hey, Thad, how about let's just do it in person rather than via Zoom? So we got your ambient noise that Thad likes so much.
I think it adds a little something, and anybody listening can let us know that we're crazy or we're right. But I like hearing, Coach back there yelling at people.
Coach yelling, sometimes players going into the boards or balls going off the boards. It's, yeah.
It's all good. All right, we have not recorded for a little while, just the last two games. So, an overtime loss at Cable Dome Arena, and then a win in St. Louis.
Well, for any Comets fans that were ready to take the victory lap with the I-70 Cup, St. Louis said not so fast. And so St. Louis obviously came to Kansas City with a different game plan in mind.
They did.
If you're an outdoor traditional, you would call it a low block. That's not how we described it on air. We described it as 5 players behind the ball, and they created all sorts of problems and frustrations for the Comets, who found themselves without a goal in that first half, down 2-0. And what was interesting is we've talked a lot about Coach Stokic's commitment to the transition game. We saw St. Louis run the transition game effectively well, and ultimately their transition game won the game for them.
Yeah, Kansas City has not been used to teams essentially flipping the script, heavily flipping the script, because Kansas City doesn't mind holding the ball. It's just that they didn't want to have all of the ball, I guess.
Well, and so it creates problems. Nick Vassos on air was describing this as like the half-court game in basketball, and I think that's pretty fair, is Kansas City would rather run with teams as opposed to knocking the ball around and looking for holes, and it puts a lot of pressure on your back line to score when all 5 field players are sunk tight in, because the passing lanes aren't there the way you would like. And ultimately, if other teams do this, and I could see teams defending UCFC the same way, because UCFC wants to run, they want to score, they don't want to be patient. How are you going to score from the back line? Because you're going to have to find a way to break down and get teams to come out of their shell.
Even with St. Louis playing that bunker, that 5 guys behind the ball, the low block, whatever you want to describe it, parking a bus, Comets were still able to generate a lot of shots. It's just that they weren't a lot of them that were necessarily on goal, but yet the keeper made a ton of saves also.
Paulo was amazing both games, and if you look at the shots, some of the saves he made, we expected of him. It was just the quantity that was there, and I think the Comets were getting frustrated. And were it not for Paulo, I think things could have broken in a different way, but kudos to him. He always wants to play big against Kansas City, and both games he held St. Louis in to have a chance, and they took advantage of it in Cable Dome Arena.
In outdoor, I generally hate that style of the bunkering or parking the bus or whatever term you want to use. Indoor, though, it's still exciting because you still create a lot of shots and such forth. It's just they're sometimes not as good as shots as you want to take, or that catching them the way you want to catch them. But it was an effective method.
Well, there's a team, you and I go way back in the indoor game. There was a team that won a championship with this mindset, and that was the 86-87 Dallas Sidekicks. They would put 5 behind the ball, and then when they got the ball, you would see Tattoo or somebody else spring open. And what did we see from St. Louis? It was either a Will Esquet thing or a Frank Tayu thing. Somebody was going to get open, and if you're the Comets, you have to be really, really careful on teams trying to counter you. We've talked about it a lot last season, right. And St. Louis made them pay. I thought Kansas City made good adjustments in Game 2. Different result.
Yeah, different result, although not that different of a result. I mean, it came out on a regulation win, so yes, and that way it's different. But the amount of shots, the amount of goals was not greatly different.
I think what we saw on the New Year's Eve game was the dominance of Real Marquez, who wound up finding the ball in space. And he's just so difficult to defend unless you're somebody approaching his size. And he looked dominant. He looked, may I say it, all-star quality. The game he played there at the Family Arena.
Wonder why you use that term, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure, here shortly. Do you think other teams will try to emulate that when they come to play the Comets?
Well, I said this on air on the first game, the Saturday night game. St. Louis has been watching video, and teams watch. They do watch.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, ultimately, and try to figure out what is it that we can do differently to get an edge or get an advantage. And I think that St. Louis saw something there as a possibility, and the teams that were effective against Kansas City last year beat them on the transition game. I'm thinking UCFC for sure. I remember in particular, if you can find a way to frustrate the Comets offensively, and then just hope that they lose their focus. And Coach Stokic said after that game, we lost too many runners on their team. And you and I had an opportunity to talk to him after the Comets' victory in St. Louis. And he said, better, but we still lost too many runners even though we won. And so a lot of that is just going to be the mental game of indoor soccer. Sure, physically and tactically things are going to happen, but mentally you have to be dialed in for all 60 minutes, because one lapse of judgment or attention and the other team's going to make you pay.
That's part of that whole bunkering thing, is that you can get them to make the mistake and then you have your fast guy or two or whatever make that counter. You know, nobody's the old Barcelona that could just pass the ball around forever and hardly ever lose the ball. Somebody's going to make a mistake, and all it takes is the one mistake, and all of a sudden you're now just concentrating on trying to keep the ball. Once you lose it, that mental transition takes a second.
Well, and on the second goal, the one that Taiyu scored, change of possession, loss of possession, whatever you want to call it, in the forward third, and all of a sudden Lucas Almeida looks up and he sees Taiyu on a glide path one-on-one with Ejimadu and led him perfectly. And those are the situations I would see other teams trying to put themselves in against Kansas City.
And again, in all fairness, because I've kind of jokingly, commented that the ambush changed a lot of players, but they didn't change the coach. But the coaching made a change to face the Comets, and they did well. So, I mean, kudos to them.
No, and it put Kansas City in a must-win situation. I think that MSL Monday did a preview of that game, and they said, Phil Labonco said, this is a must-win for Kansas City. We've said this a lot this season. If you want to be a top-tier team, you can't be dropping points. And so they dropped 2 points at home on Saturday. They absolutely needed to get 3 on Tuesday, and they did what they set out to.
Yeah, you can't be dropping those points. The must-win. And I still want to. I mean, obviously, I think the Comets are playing well. They've looked good, but I don't expect St. Louis to be a top half team or top third team, for sure. Dallas was. I don't expect them to be great. The overtime loss in Milwaukee is obviously, I don't want to say a decent result, but it's a decent result on the road against Milwaukee-ish. So we still have to see how the Comets are going to do when they face teams that should be in the top third.
So, and we're no longer in December, we're in January, and you get past a lot of those games and looking ahead. Milwaukee will be talking about coming to Kansas City this Sunday. That's always a heated matchup. Empire and the firepower that they have the following Friday.
Yep.
You have to go to San Diego for a midweek game. Chihuahua coming back here on the 25th, I believe, and that's a Ron Newman Cup rematch. And so these games, not that any game doesn't matter more than anything, but when you're looking at teams that you're battling for playoff position, you want to gain the full 3 and take away the opportunity at the full 3 every single time now.
And those points are supremely important there, but I also look at it that it's important that they gain that confidence that when they're playing those teams that they can beat them. And again, I know you don't want to disrespect any team, but if you've beat St. Louis 3 times out of 4. Okay, great, but you want to beat the San Diegos, the Empires, etc. So,
well, here's the thing about St. Louis. If I'm a St. Louis fan, I don't know how good that team is because if you take out Kansas City, right? They battled against Milwaukee and lost. They beat Dallas. You're trying to figure out, okay, where do we stand? Great. We'll see Kansas City again in February, but where do we stack up with these other teams? Where do we stack up with Harrisburg? Where do we stack up with Texas? Where do we stack up with Empire? They want to figure out, are we a top 8 team or are we on the outside looking in? And they don't know yet.
No, honestly, a lot of teams don't know. It's a quarter of the way into the season, though, and we still don't really know how they are because of the quirks of the schedule and such forth.
I think we can guess, though. I mean, just there's now at the top, it's starting to get clearer who's there. I think for me, the surprise team this year is the Baltimore Blast. Baltimore went into Utica on New Year's Eve and won there, with a caveat that Kelvin Oliveira wasn't there because he's in Italy representing Brazil in Kings Cup Kings League tournament.
Yep.
So that's a win with an asterisk, but at the end of the year, it doesn't matter whether there's any asterisk or not. You play with who you have, whether they're eligible to play, injured, doesn't matter. But Baltimore, save for a loss at Milwaukee, and they were competitive that game, this is an undefeated team.
It's a little more. It is surprising from what I would have expected going into the season. I always expect them to kind of do well. It's just based on history, but that doesn't always play out.
The other thing we're seeing in Baltimore was one of those teams that played the old guard all the time, and they had a roster refresh, let's call it that. And so you're seeing newer guys, younger guys taking the mantle, and it's not so much the same Tony Donatelli, Vinny Dantas, the same guys that you would see every year. And no, this is a team now that Kansas City's going to have to think about as they're looking at playoff position. Definitely Chihuahua. San Diego's going to be up there. UCFC is going to be up there. Milwaukee is always going to be competitive. And then you start adding Baltimore in. That's probably your top, if I count it right, 6.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. And then we'll see Tacoma. They have some big games coming up. Empire, we'll see them here in a couple weeks. Actually, a week and a half.
Yeah, this is that time that I just don't feel like we really know what those teams are.
Right.
I mean, we can look at them and based on history. Milwaukee's always been good. Baltimore has normally been good. Kansas City's been good. St. Louis has normally not been good. We just can't count on that right now because as this last offseason went, it seemed like every team that was low was retooling and getting better players or new players, and you have teams that have a lot of young players that are, how are they going to, they show talent, but you still got to develop. Kansas City's in that boat. We still have young players that have a lot of opportunity. We'll have to see how they'll turn out.
I think I think it's fair to say, maybe with maybe 2 exceptions, that every team decided we need to upgrade. Yeah. And you look across the board, San Diego bringing in Luis Morales, who's arguably a top 5 player. In addition to everybody else that they have on that roster, St. Louis spent some money to bring in both Tayus, etc. You look at UCFC, they lost Tayu, they brought in Vinny Dantas, and so every team is trying to figure out, how do we get just a little bit better? Because you're going to have to be at least a little bit better to knock off Chihuahua.
All right, let's take a little commercial break, and we'll be right back. All right, segment 2. Milwaukee coming up. We already talked a little bit about them. What do we expect from them? Obviously a tough game. They're always going to be a tough, that's that rivalry with Kansas City, but what do you expect?
Well, just when you think that they're turning the page in a post-IB26 world, and we'll be looking at other players in terms of who we spotlight on air on Sunday. But IB26 broke the 400 barrier in terms of 400 MASL goals, 4 goals the other night against Dallas. Kudos to him. He just keeps scoring, and he knows the game so well. He puts himself in positions, and so It's him again. It's Mario Alvarez. The player I would encourage fans to watch out for is Alex Sanchez, who is scoring goals, making assists, and he's that next generation player, as you were talking about in the last segment with the Comets, looking for that next generation. Sanchez is that next generation talent for Milwaukee. Some of the traditional names that Comets fans know and love, Derek Huffman, etc. Willie B in goal, and Willie B will stop a lot of shots, and so I will expect an intense game. And not that it didn't matter or mean anything. The Comets know that they dropped points in Milwaukee. They feel like they should have won in regulation and gotten all 3 points. So
there was that little bit of not questionable, but a little bit of controversy around one of the goals.
But even in the end,
right.
Giving up a goal less than 10 seconds left in regulation, you have to find a way to close out games. They didn't, and so they feel like they have something to prove. And Milwaukee, if you recall the last time Milwaukee came to Kansas City, and this was in the playoffs last year, and the Comets were smoking them, and then they went sixth attacker and took it. This was game 2 of that 3-game series. Took it to overtime, kept sixth attacker in, and Christian Andreo scored the game-winning goal. This is a team that battles regardless of where they are. They're extremely well coached, and I would imagine that this game has been circled on their calendars for quite some time because they also have some bad taste in their mouth.
Yeah, they have that history. Both teams have that history long-term and just recently over the last year. Again, like I said, the controversial goal being called back, the win last year against them in Milwaukee, or against Milwaukee here, all of that plays into both those teams wanting to face each other and take that win. How much do you think that really plays into it, or is that just a lot of media and fan speculation?
Well, I think definitely the fans get in there, but it's hard when you're battling for a championship and you can see something in your grasp, and then whether it's your own doing or circumstances, etc., definitely players in Milwaukee are going to come down with something to prove, and likewise with Kansas City. I mean, I think that it wasn't enough, or it wasn't good enough in Milwaukee. They started off strong. They didn't finish strong, and Coach Stokic has higher expectations than that.
Yeah, and we know that there will be some players that like to play against each other, Huffman, Neto, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is what makes this rivalry unique. I would still argue historically the Kansas City-St. Louis rivalry is the longest standing in the league, but in terms of intensity, I know Milwaukee and Baltimore have had their own history, but I don't think it's as intense as Kansas City and Milwaukee.
Nobody really likes Baltimore, so.
Wow.
Over the over 6 games, Philip has started in vast majority of them. Yeah,
so it's fair to say that Neto's still not 100%. B, that Philip has been playing well. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Right? And so I think it was on the last episode when you asked me about Philip, and I said, okay, talk to me again in January when Coach Stokic has to decide who's starting against Milwaukee, San Diego on the road, Chihuahua, etc. And so now we'll see where this is. I think that Coach Stokic has enough confidence in Ejimadu where if he's in a better position to get a win, he's the starter. I don't see that as a problem. What I will tell you, though, is in terms of pressure situations, Neto has more experience handling that adversity. Sometimes you learn adversity on the fly, but it's a good problem to have choices there in goal, because that hasn't always been the case.
The choices are good. It's just interesting that we've only seen Neto once so far this year. And it was in Milwaukee.
Well, but that tells you, so if Philip is 100% and Neto isn't, Coach Stokic is going to go with the goalkeeper who's 100%. There are times, not just in Kansas City history, but other teams in indoor soccer where a coach would say, I will play a less than 100% starter because I have more faith in that person than the next option.
I think there's always two reasons you look at who you're going to start in goal is who's better at that moment, but you also will have to look at developing players. So getting Philip a lot of playing time early and against some teams that are not historically as strong is probably also in that balance of who he starts. Now it will be real interesting to see with Milwaukee coming in. Will it go back to Neto? Will it stay with Philip? That's going to probably be more a choice exactly at that moment. Who will get me the better chance to win today? That's not going to be about getting Philip experience. That's going to be about getting the win.
We've moved on.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, there may still be games where it's get Philip more experience, but it's going to be about getting that win because that's a definite rival for a top spot.
Well, and just looking ahead at the calendar, there are going to be some pressure games, particularly on the road. I would say Chihuahua here, pressure game, because they have no fear. They're coming to play regardless. But you think about road games at San Diego, at Chihuahua, at UCFC, at Baltimore. These are places where it's not your standard venue where, hey, we're just going to go in and do our thing. They're unique features in each of those places that it's going to put pressure on not just the goalkeeper but all the field players too in terms of maintaining focus and dealing with adversity.
All right, we've talked about the Comets pretty much exclusively or how they were matching up with other teams. A little bit about some other stuff around the league, but is there any other things around the league that might be interesting to talk about today?
Maybe the All-Star selection. New year?
Yeah.
All-Star game. So we're recording this on January 2nd. On January 1st, the league dropped the initial 28 All-Stars. 24 All-Stars. 24 All-Stars. Yeah, 4 more coming from the fans. So to be clear, this was a vote of players across the league, coaches, and I think one staff person per franchise, right? So I think there's been all sorts of questions in terms of how was this judged, because in different sports it's different approaches where it's a fan vote versus a non-fan vote. Is it for this season or is it more broadly how they're doing? People have made comments about it's a little early in the season, and what I would tell you is to get to Utica, New York on February 12th, which is a Wednesday, and you'll have to be there before, you cannot fly to Utica. You're going to fly probably to Syracuse. And so you're probably trying to figure out, how do I get all these players from point A first to point B, then to point C, which is Syracuse, and then I've got to get them in some vehicle from Syracuse to Utica. So they needed to have this locked down early. And so for fans who are like, oh, they should have waited a couple more weeks no.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that.
Right.
I understand why, but at the same time, let's just be happy there's an all-star game.
Well, there's that. Here's the second thing is, for those of you who have looked at ballots in other leagues, it's not like every player shows up on the ballot, right? And so there's been particular questions about goalkeeper selection because Neto, as you mentioned earlier, has only played one game. Let's make the assumption that Neto was the Kansas City goalie on that ballot.
Yeah.
Right? So players voted how players felt in terms of quality, but the fact that, I mean, you just do the math, there's more players than coaches than staff.
Yeah.
Players across the league picked Neto as one of the best 3 goalkeepers. That's the players.
Yeah.
That's not fans. That's not Neto haters, Huffman lovers. I mean, put all that aside.
Yeah.
The players, and you think about some of the other goalkeepers that are in this league, what does that say? And so, you know, some Comets fans have heard me over years defending Neto. All I got to say is this: you don't have to have a conversation with me about Neto. Go talk to not only his teammates who voted for him, maybe they felt like they had to, talk to players on the other 11 teams across the league who voted for him, and then we can have a conversation.
All right. Should I, after the game against Milwaukee, ask Huffman who he voted for?
I guess you could. What's interesting, and you know, that's a franchise or a fan base that tends to, like Festivus, they like to air their grievances that they only had 2 players selected in that first 24, so Ian Bennett and then Mario Alvarez. And so fan vote is coming out. I know that there's at least one Wave player in that group of what's going to happen is fans will get to vote for 4 players, 1 goalkeeper, 1 defender, and then 2 forwards. It's basically forward midfielder, right? There'll be opportunity for teams to, and you see this in other sports, like the Chiefs have been doing it with the Pro Bowl ballot, vote for our guys.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see if Milwaukee then rallies to say, hey, we only got 2, Kansas City got 4, we've got to get out the vote and do what we can.
Oh, I'm sure they will, absolutely. How are they going to divvy up these players? Because it just lists 24 players and then 4 more.
Haven't seen that yet. So that's the challenge. Hey, fans wanted 1 table, right?
Yeah.
What? Great. You got 1 table, but the European leagues don't have to worry about all-star games. So when you try to figure out how are we going to do this, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether this is going to be coaches drafting for their teams. I haven't heard.
But who's the coaches?
Coming soon. I have some insider information, but I am not in a position to share that. The league will announce when the league wants to announce.
I can officially announce that I am not one of them.
Well, sorry, Thad,
How about you?
but I'm definitely not a coach for this game.
So we leaked info there.
That's something, right? But yeah, and then the commissioner, I can't recall if it's 1 or 2 commissioner picks too, and so I think I don't want to predict what the commissioner is going to do, but if you look at some of the newer stars around the league, they probably didn't appear on the ballot the way that some of the more traditional players are. So there may be an opportunity to go back in. There may be also an opportunity to give kudos to retiring players or players who are on the later side of the career to say, hey, here's your last hurrah. But it's an all-star game. It's going to be great, and I guarantee you that Utica, New York is going to put on a show, and they're going to welcome people there. It may be cold, it may be snowy, but that arena will be rocking on February 12th.
And they got cool boards.
They do.
They looked good in what I watched of the game. I didn't watch a lot of that game yet.
It's hard to tell watching on a small screen. So what they've done, if you hadn't heard, the Adirondack Bank Center, and people refer to the Odd, but it's the Adirondack Bank Center. They are the first arena in North America to add digital boards for a hockey indoor soccer arena, and so they're covered with plexiglass, right? And so the ball bounces. It'll be interesting to see how the ball bounces differently on glass rather than your traditional boards, and how teams adjust to it. But it's pretty for sure.
Yeah. I was watching the Winter Classic, the hockey game between St. Louis and the Blackhawks up in Wrigley, and they had digital boards.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, wait a minute. Oh yeah, that's right. First arena to have it, so they were. I think they had it first up there anyway. But I was just like, hey, now they're using it. I wonder if that's going to start to become a more common
It'll be interesting to see it. You can do all sorts of things. It's like what you would see at a sporting game or a current game with LED lighting.
Yep.
You can get a little bit more creative in addition to your sponsors and how your sponsors show up there. And then on goals, UCFC has goal and like stretching in blue letters, and good for them. I think that they're looking for opportunities to sell that experience, and they've come up with something that's unique to them.
All right, back to the All-Star game for a second. Who are the Comets that were in there?
Sure. So 4 Comets. So by the way, the Comets of the 24, Comets had the most players selected. So from a peer experience, you can conclude that their peers around the league have a lot of respect for the quality in the lineup. Let's go from top to back, right? 2 target forwards. We've talked about them both a lot, Zach Reggett and Rion Marquez. Zach has, in his pedigree, co-Golden Boot winner last year, teams are battling with him, and so the goal production isn't where he would like it to be this year. Rion on the other side, Rion Marquez, he's among the league leaders in scoring, and teams are having a hard time. This is the Rion Marquez we've been waiting for in terms of just dominating other teams. And so he definitely earned that too. And I would say that Zach, that's probably more a reflection on the quality of his work than specifically his performance year to date.
Yeah. I think a lot of these votes are going to be like, oh, we've known he's great for 6 years.
Sure.
It's not just necessarily what you did this year. And again, early because teams haven't played. So keep going.
Former defender of the year in the league, who's leading the league in block shots as of this moment, Chad Vandergriff. And a very, I'm sure, a consensus pick for the All-Star, and good for him. And then what we talked about earlier, Nicolau Neto was chosen as one of the top 3 goalkeepers, joining Chris Toth and Andrew Coughlin of UCFC. And so there will be a chance for the 4th goalie to be selected by fans, and there will be a chance for a 5th Comet player to be selected by fans. And so I think we can drop that. Yeah. So the fan vote is coming up. I believe it runs through January 9th. And so look for a social media announcement about that. I think by the time that you drop this, it'll be safe to say who that is. And so it'll be Leo Acosta will be up for one of those 4 seats. And so it's going to be up to Comets fans to vote strongly, vote Acosta, and see if they can get a 5th.
So I know Comets had the most from any one team. Was any other teams have 4?
No other teams had 4. So Kansas City was the only one with 4, which kudos to the players themselves, but kudos to the coaching staff and the front office for assembling a talented team. And I think that this is fair. And so everybody, not everybody, a lot of people will look at these things as popularity contests. I'd say it's probably more true when it's a fan vote than it is a player-coach vote. But I think it says a lot when your peers across the league say, hey, we think you should be representing us.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a popularity thing when it's a fan vote, or who's got the biggest fan base, or who's the most excited at that moment for a fan base. Even across the player vote, though, sometimes it's who we know has been good, not necessarily who is good now. But that's a very legitimate way to pick it because it's an all-star.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes you want to see the person who was really good for 10 years and maybe not be as good now, but you want to see them out there.
You can definitely go back in baseball history not too long ago how many people held an all-star spot for years just based on reputation rather than how good they had been that year. And so this is not different than other leagues. The fact that this is only the 2nd all-star game, there's not that in the MASL's history, there's not that repetitive pattern where people start to expect this. And to be fair, the 2020 game, which was hosted here in Kansas City, was in the middle of COVID. A lot of it was which players were available.
Who was willing to come?
Who was willing to come at the time. It was well represented, some of the same faces that were there in 2020. Talked about Ian Bennett earlier. He'll be back. Chris Toth, who was there, he'll be back. Dom Francis, he'll be back. And so there is some consistency with many of the players who played in that game. By the way, Nicolau Neto played in that 2020 game. He'll be back in 25.
All right. Anything else we need to discuss today?
Big game. I think the one thing that's going to be interesting is the weather. We joke or talk a lot in Kansas City about hot winter nights and how back in the day it could be snowing outside and there were hot winter nights in Kemper Arena. Well, we haven't had to deal with a lot of inclement weather in recent years affecting game days. Yeah. And there's a potential that it will impact crowd size on Sundays. So it'll be interesting to see how that might affect the dynamics. You might say that gives Milwaukee an advantage if the crowd is suppressed at any or at all. My counter to that is there was a pretty loud crowd this past Saturday, 4,700-ish against St. Louis rivalry game, and somehow St. Louis managed to persevere in that and win in overtime. And so, yeah, you want to have as much support as you can at home, but ultimately it's going to be the players on the field that decide who wins and who doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a while since we've had a lot of snow. I don't know how much we're supposed to potentially have. But, I mean, I remember living the game a few times and taking me 45 minutes, an hour to get home.
Or starting your car and scraping the snow and whatever else off your windshield because you were going to be in the parking lot for a little bit and you needed to be safe headed home. But, yeah, it's been a while.
After that last home game with the overtime loss, it was extremely foggy.
It was.
It was very gloomy. It kind of fit that whole night. It was a little spooky. But, all right. Appreciate the time, Eric. We will talk soon, I am sure. And any last words?
See you all Sunday. We'll be there.
We are out.